The crimes, the criminals, why did they do it? Who got hurt? Did they meet justice or commit the perfect crime? You'll find all the clues at Jim Harold's Crime Scene. Welcome to the Crime Scene. I am Jim Harold, and so glad to be with you once again. One of the biggest cases in recent years has been the one that, of course, the Netflix documentary of Making a Murderer covered, and that is of Steven Avery. Now, we had the prosecution on previously, Ken Kratz, to talk about his book and his viewpoint of the case. And we think it's equally important to always cover both sides of the issue. So in fairness, we have the defense counsel in this State versus Avery, Jerome F. Buting. We're so glad to have him with us today. He is a shareholder in the Brookfield, Wisconsin law firm of Buting, Williams, and Stilling. And we very much appreciate it. He is recipient of the Fierce Advocate Award from the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, the James Joyce Award from University College Dublin, and the Trinity College Dublin Races Elite Award. And we're so glad to have him with us, Jerome Buting. Thank you, sir, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Now, I should mention that today we'll be talking about Jerome's book, Illusion of Justice, Inside Making a Murderer in America's Broken System. First of all, I'd be curious, did you ever think that this case was going to get the profile and the notoriety that it's gotten?
No, certainly not. I mean, it was a high publicity case at the time. It was covered extensively. It was being streamed online, actually, which is pretty unusual back then. But I don't think anybody, not even Netflix, really expected it would be, this much of a worldwide sensation. I mean, it's a globally popular documentary, and even the very first day, my colleague Dean Strang and I were getting emails from as far away as South Africa and Australia from people who'd seen it already.
Now, I understand that actually when this was presented to you, you were maybe a bit leery of taking on the case of Steven Avery. Why was that?
Well, it wasn't so much that we were leery, that Dean and I were leery about taking on Steven's case. We were leery about cooperating with the documentary filmmakers.
I see.
And, I think any lawyer likes to be in control, and we knew that we would have no control. We did not have any editorial control whatsoever. When they filmed the documentary, if it was going to be made, it would be out of our hands. So, we were leery about the idea, but they had already been working. By the time we got on the case, which was about almost 4 months after he was charged, the filmmakers had already been working for 3 or 3.5 months on the case. And there was going to be a documentary one way or the other. We talked it over and decided, it's not very often that you get to see a behind-the-scenes look at what it's like to prepare a serious criminal case like a homicide. And particularly from the defense perspective, it's, you see Hollywood portrayals, but you don't see anything really behind the scenes from the defense or the prosecution. Now, I know that the filmmakers asked both the defense and the prosecution to participate. I've heard, Ken Kratz has since said that he didn't get asked until something like 2013 to sit down for an interview, and that's just not true. There's a letter in the record in the court file that shows that in fall of 2006, so even before the trial took place, one of the filmmakers is writing directly to him, asking him to participate and explaining what the project is, and he refused to do so. And the police actually did sit down, I think one of the lieutenants, and give a lengthy interview for the documentary, but then when it came time to sign away your rights to,
sure,
they refused to do that. So it's not fair to the filmmakers to say that this was one-sided and that the state didn't have a chance to participate. We thought they were or would at some point, and I think it might have been more interesting if there was both sides behind the scenes. But what they did do, I thought was kind of interesting. They even though Kratz wouldn't sit down for interviews with them. They still got a lot of his perspective presented in the film by filming the press conferences that took place, the daily press conferences at the end of every court hearing at the trial. And you'd see the court reporters, the media reporters asking Ken Kratz or his colleagues questions about the evidence, and so indirectly he's being, his perspective is being presented that way, even though he wasn't willing to cooperate with the filmmakers.
Now, when I'd asked you about your hesitancy to take the case, I was referring to, and maybe I phrased it incorrectly, you had dealt with some health challenges that maybe there was some concern about the workload, but you decided to go forward with it?
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. I misunderstood the question. There were some concerns about whether I would take on a case of that magnitude because I had a very serious cancer, very rare soft tissue sarcoma in my leg, just a few years earlier. And, I had gone through a really massive surgery, chemo, radiation regimen. I was off work for a year. And I do talk about this in my book, Illusion of Justice, because it did impact the whole decision of whether I would get on the case at that time. I had gone back to work by then, but I was still getting the scans that you get. I had been every 3 months. I think right before the Avery case involvement, it was stretched out to once every 6 months for scans, and I had not come to that sort of arbitrary 5-year, all clear time for cancer survivors. So there's always that nagging fear that
Sure.
You're going to go in and get a scan and it's back, and then what do you do? And so we did. My wife and I, who's also my law partner, and I did some soul searching, and we decided that I was ready and could do it, and God willing, that it worked out.
Now, in the book Illusion of Justice, Inside Making a Murderer in America's Broken System, and I do want to talk about the broken system, the larger implications, but Steven Avery himself, now I would imagine most people who are listening to a true crime podcast are familiar with Making a Murderer and familiar with Steven Avery's case, at least on somewhat of a level, and realize this is not someone that just came up against these charges, but he had a wrongful conviction in the past. So in some ways, if you believe that Steven Avery was convicted wrongly this second time, that it was almost like lightning striking twice. What kind of bad luck do you have to have? What were your thoughts about Avery as a person? And in regard to the wrongful conviction, and he'd been kind of given a bad deal in the past.
Well, by all accounts, people that knew him during the 2 years that he was out of custody, he was a nice man. He was, forgiving of the victim, the rape victim who had misidentified him. In fact, I was on a commission that was set up, a legislative committee, to try and examine what went wrong in the first wrongful conviction, to see if there were reforms that could be done to the criminal justice system to try and prevent another wrongful conviction. And he actually testified in front of that committee, and I think actually met with the victim in that sexual assault case, and his testimony was tearful. He hugged her at the end of the hearing. So I was as shocked as anybody to see him now, 2 years after he was released, accused of this terrible murder. It just did not seem to fit with the kind of individual who had matured in prison for 18 years and was now, about to. One of the things that always struck me was the lack of any real motive here. He was just about to receive, that very week that she disappeared, a $400,000 tax-free check from the state government, a special bill that had been passed as partial compensation for that. It had passed both houses of the legislature. It was on the governor's desk about to sign, and that's in addition to the $36 million lawsuit that he had filed against the Manitowoc County Sheriff, because it's not really, in my view, the evidence really didn't look like it was just lightning striking twice here. What happened is, when he got out and started, and actually the Attorney General's office did an investigation, it came out that there were some what appeared to be bias, deliberate attempts to mislead the sexual assault victim into identifying Steven Avery as the rapist in that case. And when the Attorney General decided not to do anything, he then filed this civil lawsuit against the county sheriff. And, right in the midst of the depositions that were going on, including very key depositions of higher-up brass, suddenly he gets accused of this murder of Teresa Halbach. And, as we got onto the case, it became evident to us that even though the Manitowoc Police or Sheriff's Department said, we're transferring lead in this investigation to the neighboring county, so we're not going to be involved, and they were telling the public that Manitowoc was not involved in the investigation. In truth, when we started getting the police reports, Manitowoc was deeply involved and found virtually every piece of important evidence that was used against Steven Avery was not found by the Calumet County Sheriff's Department or the state DCI agents. It was found by Manitowoc Sheriff's Department people who had no business being on that property to begin with, including the two that we thought the potential planting evidence pointed most directly to, which was Lieutenant Link and Sergeant Colburn, both of whom had been deposed in the civil lawsuit just 2 or 3 weeks before Teresa Halbach disappeared. And when it came time when they found the vehicle on the Avery salvage yard, and it came time to search that huge property of 44 acres and thousands of cars and a bunch of different buildings, those two raised their hand and volunteered to be the ones that would search Steven Avery's private residence and garage. Out of all the other places they could have searched, they volunteered to search his place. And then one of them finds this key under very mysterious circumstances that has none of Teresa Halbach's DNA on it, even though it was supposedly a key she used every day, and has a very small quantity of Steven Avery's DNA that their own DNA expert admitted was consistent with transference like you might get if you rub the key against someone's toothbrush. So it wasn't, in my view, lightning striking twice. This was, the evidence certainly appeared to be that this was a deliberate attempt to get rid of Steven Avery and thereby get rid of the lawsuit, not just the money, but the embarrassment that it would cause to that whole department.
So it was basically, in your view, possibly payback.
It certainly looked that way from the evidence. I mean, it was just so suspicious, and so many pieces of the evidence were suspicious, including the bones that were clear. There was clear evidence that the bones that were found on Steven Avery's property behind his garage in the burn pit had been moved, because Teresa Halbach's remains were found in at least 2 different locations and probably a third. Some of them were found in a burn barrel behind the Bobby Dassey house. Some more, and those were identified as being Teresa Halbach's, at least as definitively as the ones in the burn pit were. And then there were some more bones found in a sort of a burn site in a quarry off the Avery property, another, quarter, half mile away. Now, the interesting thing, they could never get a very definitive DNA from that third site, but they were female, human pelvis. They were burned to the same degree. So they, in all likelihood, were also Teresa Halbach. So the issue became, if these bones are moved, the question is, were they moved from Steven Avery's burn pit as the primary source or site where it was burned, or were they moved to his burn pit? And, why would you, if she was burned somewhere else and then her bones dumped in Steven Avery's burn pit, then he's clearly innocent, because nobody would burn a body somewhere else and then dump the bones in your own backyard, right? Mm-hmm. And if in fact the original site was the burn pit, then why are just a few of them moved into these two other locations? What we thought was much more probable is that burn barrel, which I don't know if you've got burn barrels in your part of the country, but these are
55. I know what they are, yeah.
Yeah, they're 55-gallon drums. They're left open to the elements, so it rains in there. There's ash in the bottom and muck. And what we thought happened was that the real perpetrator scooped up the cremains from the original burn site somewhere else, using that burn barrel, dumps them onto Stephen Avery's property, and then some of them were stuck in the bottom muck and ash of that burn barrel. So the burn barrel was a vessel to move them. That made much more sense. We had an expert who worked for the Crown in Canada, who's really like the world's expert on finding cremains in the wilderness. Believe it or not, there are such people. And his opinion was, when he's seen other cases where he's investigated where there's clear evidence that bones were moved, found in more than one site, and the majority of the time, the original site has the fewer amount of bones. It's most of the bones are found in the secondary site, which makes sense. If you're going to go to the trouble of trying to move the evidence away from an incriminating spot, you're going to get most of it and dump it somewhere else. And the other thing that was particularly suspicious about that is that there were no pictures ever taken by law enforcement of what the bones looked like in any of these three locations: the burn pit, the burn barrel, the quarry. They took thousands of pictures in this case, and yet none of them were of what it looked like, how these bones were found in Stephen Avery's burn pit. And that was important because the experts said they also didn't call in any forensic anthropologist to come and do like a grid search that would typically be done when you find remains in the outdoors. It's important because it would have shown us potentially, if you find certain bones adjacent to each other, like an elbow next to a upper arm bone, you can tell that that's most likely where the original site was. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, if they're all jumbled up, and it's more likely that they would have been dumped, and that evidence was not preserved in any way, photographically or with expert witnesses, which again raises a serious suspicion about the objectivity and fairness of the investigation.
Now, as for Avery, his status now, if I'm correct, his appeals and so forth have run out, but is there any recourse for him going forward if any new evidence comes to the fore or anything? Is there anything that can be done at this point?
Yes, there is, because even though the direct appeals are done and the time limits for a federal habeas have passed, the exception to that would be if there's newly discovered evidence of some sort. And that's how, for instance, DNA cases that are like another one that I talk about in my book, where a gentleman I was in prison wrongly convicted for 29 years before I finally got him released. Even after many, many years, you can bring a case back if there's newly discovered evidence that would have a reasonable probability of a different outcome if the jury had known about it. So he has a new attorney now, Kathleen Zellner, and she's conducting scientific tests. There's been some significant developments in science in the last 10 years. Science moves very fast. The law does not. If some of her tests uncover new scientific evidence that would support his claim, then he may very well have grounds to get it reopened. Also, if fact witnesses come forward who maybe didn't in the past because they thought, well, prosecution must have the right guy. A lot of people thought there was no question. The way the media coverage pre-trial was, it seemed very obvious that Avery was guilty. So sometimes people don't come forward under those circumstances and may have now. I'm not privy to that. but I'm sure his attorney's looking into that kind of evidence as well.
Now, not to in any way diminish what happened to Avery, but I think this opens up, and you talk about it in the book, a bigger issue about justice and about the system. Is justice, I won't say possible, is it probable for someone these days of lesser means? Is it probable? That will be the question I would ask.
Well, I think it's difficult. It's going to vary depending upon, what part of the country you are. But if you don't have the means to hire a private attorney, then you are left with a court-appointed or public defender, and somewhere between 80 and 90% of cases that are prosecuted nationwide are actually handled by public defenders or court-appointed attorneys on a list. And, some of them, particularly some of the public defenders who are staff lawyers, with offices that have training and mentoring, do a good job. Their biggest handicap is that they're overworked. They have huge case volumes, and it's difficult for them to spend the time on a complex case like the Avery case in particular. Very difficult for them to spend the time and do the kind of thorough job that's necessary. But there are also many that aren't that good. The pay is so low, particularly with court-appointed attorneys. Wisconsin now, which has this history of being a progressive state, is no longer fits that category. Certainly in criminal justice, we now have the lowest hourly rate in the country for assigned counsel that are outside of the public defender's office, and that's about 40% of the indigent cases are handled by attorneys on a private list. They're paid $40 an hour. When I moved to Wisconsin as a brand new young lawyer in 1981, 35 years ago, they were paying $45 an hour for time in court. So it's gone down, and somebody did the calculations, and that's roughly in 1981 dollars equivalent to about $150 an hour now. Overhead is more than $40 an hour, for your secretary, your rent, your malpractice insurance, your utilities, all that. So the quality of attorneys that are attracted to these kinds of cases has gone way, way down. And that makes it very difficult for people without means to get justice and to get a fair shake, because we have an adversary system that's designed to, have advocates on both sides, the prosecution and the defense. And, the theory being that as long as they're relatively equal in resources and skill, that the truth will come out and the jury or the judge will be able to discern that. But there's such an imbalance. Approximately 10 times the amount of money goes to prosecution and law enforcement than goes to indigent defense in the criminal justice system. There's such an imbalance, and it's been going on for so many decades now, that it is very difficult for people without means to get justice in this country.
Well, it's kind of tough for me, and I don't get political typically on these shows, but I will say this. On one hand, I'm very pro-law enforcement. I think that people minimize and they don't realize what our police officers and so forth have to go through. Maybe they don't understand the challenges, as I'm sure they don't understand the challenges of legal representatives in the defense system and so forth. But it's not a life or death situation. You're not going to get shot while doing a writ of habeas corpus. On the other hand, the thing that I don't understand is this. You have a wealthy person, maybe they commit some kind of trading fraud that people lose millions of dollars, and they'll get some kind of, 3 years in jail, a little bit of community service, and then you have a 17, 18-year-old kid that knocks off a liquor store with a gun and gets $59, and he's looking at 25 years. And then also the rich guy got to be defended by somebody from Harvard Law, and the poor kid got to be defended by somebody who, may have made it out of state school. Not saying state schools are bad. I graduated from a state school. But my point is, it doesn't seem fair, but I don't know what the solution is.
Well, it's not fair. And, to be clear, the vast majority of law enforcement agents are honest, dedicated servants who are trying to protect us, and they go into the job for the right reasons. But there are sadly documented cases where that's not always true. We have documented cases of police planting evidence and then getting caught. It's difficult to catch them doing that because who better than police know how to do that? But there are cases where that's happened, and in Nebraska just recently, a chief crime lab investigator was caught planting blood in a suspect's trunk. And, thankfully and unusually, he was prosecuted criminally and went to prison for it. Even though the vast majority are good, there are a few bad apples, and they're more than you think. It's difficult to say how many, but, the only way to really ferret it out is to change the law and make it easier for the defense to uncover this kind of evidence. So for instance, discovery procedures in civil cases. You mentioned, somebody with a big financial case. If it's a civil case, you have depositions, and you can bring the witnesses into a law office and put them under oath and depose them all day. And so by the time the case goes to trial, the lawyers know what the witnesses are going to say. In criminal cases, that's not true. Very few states allow depositions at all. It all too often ends up as a trial by ambush, where all you get is a police report summary of what a witness said, not recordings, not asking the kinds of questions that maybe should be asked. So where somebody's liberty is at stake, your ability to test the state's evidence is so much more difficult than it is when simply money in a civil case that's at stake. So there are some changes that can be done. It's not all doom and gloom. In my book, I set out some suggestions of reforms. Discovery is one of them. More fair and balanced distribution of resources is another. We spend so much money locking people up that it's not a surprise that we don't have the money that we need in the actual criminal justice system earlier on, like in police or in prosecution. America has about 5% of the world's population, but we incarcerate 20% of all the people in the world, or 20% of the incarcerated people in the world are from America. Why? Because we have this mass incarceration where we lock people up for very long sentences, and we don't look for alternatives. We think we're being tough on crime when we're really not. We need to be smarter on crime, and it's frankly been disappointing that the Justice Department now under Attorney General Sessions seems to be rolling back some of the bipartisan efforts that we were moving towards to obtain some reform of our justice system. If we don't spend so much money locking people up, we can provide the resources that are necessary to make sure that people aren't wrongly convicted and do get a fair shake. And, so that's one of the things that can be done. We need to reform our crime labs as well. We allow way too much so-called science in the courtroom when, in fact, it's not science. It's never been validated. So I'll give you one example. In this case, in the Avery case, they used a ballistics testimony from a guy who said that the bullet that was found in the garage that had Teresa Halbach's DNA on it came from the gun that was found in Stephen Avery's his bedroom, and came from no other gun but that. And that's just ridiculous. I mean, that kind of testimony is nowhere near as conclusive as people think. As recently as 2009, the National Academy of Science criticized ballistics, or what they call tool mark evidence, along with other types of subjective testimony where, you have an expert come in and they look at something through a double field microscope, and they've got a test bullet on one side and the crime scene bullet on the other, or when it comes to hair comparison testimony, a hair that's found at the crime scene in one field of view and a hair taken from the defendant in another, and then they just look at that, and there's no real standards on what to call when it's a match, when it's not. And the National Academy of Science has criticized that, and there's been an effort to reform to validate these kinds of so-called sciences before they're used in the courtroom. And that needs to be done more. The FBI did, to their credit, take a look at their own analysts, their own experts' testimony on hair comparison testimony cases, and they found that in some 260 cases they looked at, 95% of their experts either testified falsely or misleadingly to the jury about what they could conclude. So in those kind of eyeballing it, looking at one side and look at the other, the best they could say is that this hair might be consistent with what's found at the crime scene, but way too many of them would say that this was a match. That happened in the Ralph Armstrong case that's also talked about in my book, and now no one's doing that testing anymore, despite the fact that hundreds, if not thousands, of people were convicted with it in the past. Same thing when it comes to ballistics testimony. DNA is different. It's much more precise, much more objective, although it's the test protocols still have to be followed, and if there's contamination, the test has to be redone or thrown out, and that didn't happen in the Stephen Avery case either.
In terms of the Avery case in Making a Murderer, and then we're going to tell people where they can pick up the book, but in terms of that documentary and its reach, how has it changed your life, and what are maybe some of the positives? I've got to believe that there's some positives that have come out of this, and maybe some negatives too.
Well, it certainly was unexpected that suddenly Dean Strang and I had microphones of much bigger impact. That is not just local or state of Wisconsin reporters, but people from all over the world wanting to hear from us. And we've both spoken to lawyers groups for years about some of the flaws and problems that we think need to be corrected in the criminal justice system. But this is the first time that the general public was really interested in these issues. And so we went around, did quite a bit of public speaking, answering questions, talking about what's wrong, talking about what could be done to fix it. I think that can only be looked at as a positive. A lot of states still don't allow cameras in the courtroom. Wisconsin has for 30-some years. And, there used to be concerns about them being intrusive and lawyers grandstanding for them, and we really haven't found that to be the case, especially nowadays when they're just these little tiny things up in the ceiling no one even notices. What I think cameras do, and is what happened in this documentary, where people actually get a chance to look inside the courtrooms, see what goes on there, see what the witnesses say, what they look like when they say it, how the lawyers and judges are performing. That gives a transparency that we don't have because most people can't take off work and go sit in court all day. The other thing that we have is in Wisconsin now is mandatory recording of police interrogations. Surprisingly, only half the states require that. And again, that's the best evidence that a jury and judge should have to see just what's said by the police to the suspect, what happened to 16-year-old mentally limited Brendan Dassey, sadly happens all over the country, thousands of times a week. And that's another reform that needs to take place. The kinds of techniques that we use questioning juveniles and vulnerable adults are way too confrontational. They do produce false confessions. We know that about 25% of DNA exonerations, the people actually falsely confessed, and it's partly because of the techniques that are used. I think the good that's come out of this documentary is making people more aware of what happens in their courthouses. It's been a disruption to my practice because I've been going around speaking a lot more than I normally would. I am still a lawyer. That's what I love doing, and will continue to do. But we thought that the opportunity was here to have a conversation on justice with the general public, and people are waking up and seeing what goes on in the justice system, and they really don't like what they see. And so, my book, I think, expands on that a little bit, uses other cases as examples, not just the Stephen Avery case, and then talks about some of the reforms that I think that we can do both individually and collectively to try and get us the sort of justice that we really deserve.
Illusion of Justice Inside Making a Murderer in America's Broken System. Jerome, where can people find the book? I assume everywhere fine books are sold?
Yes, and it's online, and Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and the other independents as well. And HarperCollins, the publisher, has their own site as well. So people, it's also now available all over the world in various Amazon UK and different at least English-speaking countries. So I hope people get a chance to buy the book and read it, and hopefully we can move forward on some justice reform.
Well, certainly more information is better than less, and the readers can check out the book and decide for themselves. Jerome F. Buting, thank you for joining us today on the program.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Well, I certainly hope that you enjoyed that edition of The Crime Scene and that it provides you some food for thought. And we'll talk to you next time, and as always, be careful out there. Bye-bye, everybody.